So far, the first premise lays out this claim that the good life for a human is the life that excellently fulfills the characteristic function of a human being. The second premise comes in and says the characteristic function of a human is something using reason. The third step, the third premise, is that the life of excellent activity involving reason is the life of moral virtue. Why do we need this third step? Well, if we look up at the first premise, the good life for a human being is the life that excellently fulfills the characteristic function of a human. Plug that into the claim that the characteristic function of a human is an activity involving reason. Then we can conclude that the good life for a human being is some life that excellently uses reason, because that's the characteristic function of a human. Excellent reasoned action is the good life, because that is the characteristic function of a human being. And then this third premise comes in and builds a bridge between excellent reasoned action, which is now the thing we know as the good life, and moral virtue, which so far has not made an appearance. And Aristotle's key claim here is that excellently reasoned activity, excellently reasoned action, is virtuous action, specifically in a moral sense in most cases. And I'm doing a bit of brushing over some detail in Aristotle here. He thinks there are non-moral virtues. Certainly, we'll get to this next week, but for now the focus will be on moral virtue. So why does he think that the excellent activity involving reason is morally virtuous activity? Well, here's the thought. Let's step back and ask ourselves, what is a moral virtue anyway? What is generosity or bravery or compassion or justice? What are these things? Well, a relatively plausible definition, and one Aristotle accepts, I think Mencius probably would accept as well, and that I think tracks with our ordinary use of the term, is that a virtue is a habit or disposition. That is, a virtue isn't just a single one-off act. If you help somebody who is in need one time because you're in a good mood, but the next day when you're in a bad mood, you are completely selfish and pass by someone else who needs your help desperately, and you're just like, no, I can't, not today. Then, it's good that you did the good thing yesterday, but you're not virtuous yet. Virtue is more consistent. It's a disposition to act consistently. And it's not just action. It's a disposition, this is our definition, to have rational emotions, that is, to feel appropriately, and then to act or behave rationally on the basis of those emotions. Or for short, it's a disposition or habit to consistently feel and act according to reason. When you pass by somebody who clearly is hungry and is in a bad spot, and they have a sign, they're asking for money, and you can tell that things are rough for them, the rational response is a kind of welling up of compassion, a feeling of, I am also a human who, whether I've been that hungry or not, I know what it's like to be hungry temporarily, very unpleasant feeling. And if it's bad for me, it must be very bad for them. That sense of identifying with the person who is in need is a rational feeling to have. And then you've got a choice once you have this feeling. Do I act on it? Or do I think I don't really want to, maybe there's some risk involved. Maybe I feel weird about stopping to talk to this person. Maybe I don't want to part ways with my money. You have a choice to make then. Do you act on it or not? And the claim is that rationally behaving according to that rational emotion, that is acting compassionately on the basis of your compassion, is the action that the virtuous person would take. So we can run through this with pretty much any emotion Aristotle thinks, any basic human emotion, like fear. So on the left here, we've got our line. The further you go to the left, you've got less fear. And the further you go to the right, you've got more fear. So let's suppose you've like encountered a bear on a trail as you're hiking. Some people might be filled with so much fear when they see this bear that they're overcome by it and they just immediately turn and run. Turns out that's not a good idea. That if the bear sees you, and especially if there are like cubs around, that may trigger the bear's chase instinct. And it may have otherwise left you alone, but if it sees you running, it might think, I need to go get that. That's prey. So an excessive amount of fear in this circumstance is going to get you in trouble. But feeling no fear, which sometimes people describe as the definition of bravery, Aristotle definitely doesn't think that. Feeling no fear and being like, I'm going to walk up to this bear and kick it, that would be incredibly stupid. And irrational of you to not feel fear at this large animal that could easily rip you to shreds. So a deficient amount of fear is also irrational here. An excessive amount and a deficient amount, both irrational. The reasonable amount of fear is somewhere in between. That is what Aristotle calls the mean amount of fear. And that's the rational amount of fear that one should feel when one encounters a bear. And that amount may be different for other objects. If you encounter a mouse, a very different amount of fear is called for than if you encounter a bear. How do you determine all that? Reason. That's something that my dog, as great as he is, cannot do. He can't sit back and think, what's the rational thing for me to feel here? Then, in addition to the feeling, the reasonable amount of fear, the virtue of courage is feeling that consistently and acting on it. Acting on it appropriately. So in the case of the bear, you should feel some fear because that bear is dangerous, but you shouldn't feel so much that it causes you to turn and flee. Nor should you feel so little that you stupidly ignore the warning signs and walk right into danger. Instead, you should feel some fear, stand still, be very careful because you know you're in danger, and stand as still as you can. This is the advice they give you. And wait for the bear to pass. It may not notice you. If it does, if it gets closer to you, you're supposed to try to make yourself look as big as possible and sometimes be intimidating, like try to wave your hands and yell. But again, don't turn your back and run. That takes a lot of like self-control, and all of that is using your reason. And that's the thing Aristotle thinks you should do. And if you get out of that situation having controlled yourself and controlled your emotions, but having felt appropriately fearful, you will have displayed an instance of courage. And if you do that consistently in other circumstances, you will have the virtue of courage. So for every emotion for Aristotle, you've got the mean amount or the reasonable amount, which is the virtue, and then on either side, the vice. So to go back to that third premise, why is it that the life of excellent activity involving reason is the life of moral virtue? Well, when we think about what a moral virtue is, it just is the excellent use of reason to feel rational emotions and act rationally on the basis of those emotions. That's why for Aristotle, moral virtue and excellently using reason go hand in hand. So it follows from those three premises, once we have the good life for a human being is the life that excellently fulfills the characteristic function of a human, plug in that has the function of a human is something to do with an activity involving reason. It follows that the good life is excellently using reason. And then the third premise comes in and says, the life of excellent activity involving reason is the life of moral virtue. Therefore, the good life for a human is the life of moral virtue. So that's the function argument, and that is Aristotle and his account of the good life. If you are virtuous, he says, you will live a flourishing life because you will be doing what is distinctively human and doing it well.